In the early morning, the animal shelter on the outskirts of Houston was usually a place of heavy silence, broken only by the distant hum of cars on the freeway and the sound of workers shuffling through their routines. But that day, the quiet didn't last. Barking exploded in the air, sharp and frantic, followed by the unmistakable clatter of metal against metal. Rocky, the big tan mutt that everyone at the shelter knew all too well, had escaped his crate once again. People rushed across the hallway, trying to figure out how he'd gotten loose this time, hands trembling a bit as they fumbled with their radios. No one got too close. Rocky had a reputation for being unpredictable, sometimes aggressive, and barely any of the staff felt confident enough to go near him after the last few close calls. The workers tried to approach carefully, calling out, but you could sense their fear. Rocky darted between the old wooden benches, nose twitching, eyes wide and alert. He didn't seem mean, more cornered and lost, but none of the staff were willing to risk a bite. All around, people looked at each other, waiting for someone braver to step up or just hoping the situation wouldn't turn worse. Then Olivia appeared, holding her daughter Ruby's hand. Olivia was a single mum, and this morning there hadn't been anyone to look after Ruby while she picked up donated supplies at the shelter, so she had brought her along. The contrast just at that moment was striking. Olivia and Ruby, with their deep brown curls, their skin a shade darker than anyone else in the building, standing there together in the grey-tinted world of the shelter. Most folks there weren't used to seeing a black child walking through those halls, especially with a dog like Rocky on the loose. You could feel the discomfort coming off the staff as they watched Ruby. A few exchanged worried glances, and someone even mumbled under his breath about how dangerous it was. Olivia took it all in with a steady face. She'd been dealing with unease like that her whole life, and wouldn't let it show in front of Ruby. She squeezed her daughter's hand and whispered to reassure her, moving between the uneasy workers and their worried stares, determined not to let the tension in the room sink in any deeper. As soon as Olivia walked through the main gate, she could feel eyes following her every step. It was more than just the staff now. Even Rocky, pacing nervously on the far side of the yard, seemed to watch her with an intensity that was hard to read. His gaze was sharp and animal, uncertain whether he was sizing up a threat or just searching for something he could not name. The sense of tension in the air was thick, and Olivia's body reacted on its own. She pulled Ruby close, gently moving her own body between her daughter and the loose dog. No one said a word, but you could see their worry in the way everyone held their breath. But Ruby, small and determined with her backpack crooked on one shoulder, had other ideas. In a split second, she slipped out from under Olivia's protective arm. Before Olivia could react, Ruby walked toward Rocky, stopping just far enough away that she could seem both brave and careful all at once. The world seemed to freeze. Staff members called out in hushed tones, a few reaching for their phones in case things took a turn. But Ruby's focus was only on the dog. She knelt down, right there on the concrete, ignoring how dirty it was or how cold the morning felt. Reaching into her pocket, Ruby pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing, one she had worked on the night before, a simple, brightly colored sketch of a dog and a child under a giant oak tree. She held it out, arm extended, her fingers steady. She didn't say a word, but there was something so open and gentle about her gesture that even the adults around almost forgot to breathe. Rocky's wild eyes shifted from Olivia to Ruby, then to the drawing. It was as if, for the first time, the usual fear and tension in his posture drained away. He sniffed the air, took a few tentative steps toward the girl, then, in a slow and almost deliberate motion, lay down right beside the iron gate, mere feet from Ruby. He put his head down, eyes locked on the simple piece of paper, and released a heavy, low sigh that made everyone around exhale too. The entire mood of the shelter changed. Instead of anxious whispers and stern warnings, there was now shocked silence, followed by a wave of quiet amazement as people realized that maybe compassion could do what fear never could. Ruby's small act had not only reached Rocky, but had softened the edges of the whole place, even if just for a moment. Word traveled fast through the hallways of Houston Paws Rescue. It was the kind of moment that staff whispered about, replaying in their heads and trying to explain to anyone who would listen. People gathered around the break room coffee pot and near the side entrance, voices low but insistent. Some, like Mike, the senior handler who'd seen every type of stray pass through those doors, shook their heads in disbelief, muttering that it had to be a fluke. Mike, always quick to judge risky situations, didn't trust the peace he'd seen. It unsettled him more than any growling or barking ever could. Others took a harsher view, letting old prejudices spill into their gossip. There were quiet comments about how a child like her should never have been anywhere near a dog with Rocky's record. The unstated part, thick in the air, was about Ruby's skin and family, things the staff had rarely talked about openly. But that simmered just below the surface. A new volunteer, Sharon, sounded nervous as she confided in another, "If something had gone wrong, we all know folks would be asking questions, especially since it was her." Even those who wanted to believe in the magic of that moment were reminded of how quick blame could spread and how some risks felt different depending on who took them. Meanwhile, back in the far corner of the yard, Olivia watched Ruby carefully. From behind a row of potted bushes, she tried to keep her posture casual so her daughter wouldn't sense her nerves. Inside, her heart was pounding with a mix of pride and worry. She'd always taught Ruby to face the world with her head held high, but she understood better than anyone that sometimes people saw courage as trouble, especially when it came from a little black girl. There was relief in seeing Rocky's calm and pride in Ruby's gentle boldness, but Olivia was also keenly aware of the double standards at play. She could almost hear the thoughts, how quickly folks might shift their focus from the stray's behavior to casting scrutiny on a mother's choices or a child's place. In that moment, Olivia wrapped her arms around herself and silently promised she would stand by her daughter, ready to shield her from whatever judgments the world might throw their way. While the adults continued with their heated discussions just out of earshot, a gentle calm settled in the corner of the yard between Ruby and Rocky. It was as if the world had shrunk to just the two of them, each on their own patch of grass, but somehow sharing the same unspoken understanding. Ruby, crouched near the edge of the crate, started to hum softly, a sweet, steady tune she remembered from Sunday mornings at her grandmother's church. There was nothing fancy about the melody, and she didn't need to sing it loud. The sound drifted through the chain-link fence, weaving into the air. Almost right away, Rocky's ears twitched. He shifted his weight, the sharp wariness in his eyes softening bit by bit as he listened. Ruby noticed how his breathing steadied, how his nose lifted just a little, as if he was trying to catch every soft note. Something about the quiet music seemed to ease both of them, like the endless warnings and worries of the adults just melted away. For a moment, Ruby forgot about the eyes darting from window to window and let herself believe Rocky was just another friend in need of a little kindness. She smiled, encouraged by the change in Rocky's posture. Feeling brave, she slowly reached, her hand through the fence, palm out. She wanted to offer him a gentle touch, just like she had seen her grandmother do with strays back in her neighborhood. But before her hand even got close to Rocky, a sharp voice cut through the air. Sharon, the new volunteer, couldn't hold back her anxiety and shouted a warning. The sound crashed over the yard, turning all heads in their direction and filling the air with a sudden tension. Everyone seemed to freeze, bracing for something bad. But Rocky didn't snap or retreat. Instead, he pressed his big nose carefully to Ruby's small hand, sniffing gently while keeping his body relaxed. He refused to go further or pull away, as if he was willing to meet Ruby halfway, but needed to set his own limits. The staff nearby stared in disbelief, some with hands halfway up to their mouths. In that moment, yet another line was crossed between fear and trust. Ruby didn't try to push her luck. She watched Rocky quietly, understanding that trust needed patience and space. Somehow, the simple act, her quiet song, his gentle sniff, set the stage for whatever might come next, softening the air and leaving everyone with a sense that something important had just shifted. In the days that followed, the story of Ruby and Rocky spread across Houston. Folks who had hardly paid attention to the rescue before were suddenly stopping by, peering over the fence in hopes of catching a glimpse of the brave girl and the misunderstood dog. Some just wanted to see for themselves if the rumors were true. Others came with their own ideas about why such a bond shouldn't be allowed. The whispers at the grocery store, the side conversations at the corner diner, and even posts in local Facebook groups seemed to all center around the same pair, one little girl, one tough-looking stray, and the shelter at the heart of it all. The staff at Houston Paws Rescue found themselves at a crossroads. Mike and a few others argued that it wasn't right to keep letting Ruby visit Rocky, pointing out the risks and worrying about what could happen if things went wrong. "We've got liability to think about," he said, shaking his head. "No one wants to have to call an ambulance." But others, Sharon among them, wondered if maybe what Rocky needed wasn't strict rules or more distance, but something simple and honest, like the connection he'd found with Ruby. Some suggested that letting things unfold might even help. The shelter's reputation, which had sometimes struggled after a few rough adoptions and rumors over the years. All this left Olivia caught somewhere in the middle, the weight of it all growing as the days passed. She'd always taught Ruby to walk tall, to know her worth even when folks tried to put her in a box. But now Olivia worried, not just about the dog, but about what kind of mark all this attention would leave on her daughter. She could see the excitement in Ruby's eyes after every visit, the quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Yet she was haunted by the looks they got, the way some people watched Ruby like she was a question to be answered rather than a person to be known. Still, Olivia couldn't deny what she was seeing between her daughter and Rocky. Each time they met, she noticed how the dog, once so fearful and rough, had started to look for Ruby. There was a change happening in both of them, small but unmistakable. Trust, it seemed, was growing quietly between two hearts that had every reason to be suspicious. Olivia watched and hoped, holding on to the idea that maybe, for once, something good could be allowed to bloom even under so many watchful eyes. Looking for answers and maybe a bit of peace in all the confusion, Olivia decided to start volunteering. At Houston Paws Rescue, she wanted to keep a close eye on the situation, but she also hoped being there might help her understand Rocky better. It was one thing to worry from a distance, another to be right in the thick of the quiet chaos, folding towels and walking dogs beside the same people who'd been so quick to judge her daughter. With every shift, Olivia became more comfortable, moving around the shelter's maze of wire runs and weathered kennels. She talked to the regulars, helped dish out bowls of dry kibble, and slowly gained access to the back office where old case files were kept. On a slow Tuesday afternoon, while searching for any useful records about Rocky, Olivia stumbled on a dust-covered notebook tucked at the back of a drawer. Curiosity got the better of her, and she sat down on an empty crate to page through it. The diary, signed by a former staff member named Martha, dated back nearly 7 years. The early pages were filled with stories about Rocky's arrival as a puppy. Martha described a different dog than the one the staff knew now. She wrote about a goofy, loving pup who would tumble into her lap and play with garden hoses in the Texas sun. Then, as the entries went on, the tone changed. There were notes about neglect, about Rocky getting hurt, about the slow hardening of a once sweet spirit. Reading Martha's words, Olivia felt a heaviness settle into her chest. Rocky's history was marked not only in his body, but deep in his heart, pain hidden beneath fur and muscle, unspoken and untouched. As Olivia closed the old diary, her own memories started to echo back to her, stories she rarely spoke aloud. She remembered how, growing up, she'd learned to blend into rooms where people's stares lingered too long, where every action and word might be judged for reasons that had nothing to do with her. It was easy now to see that Rocky wasn't just an aggressive animal. He carried wounds that didn't heal just because time had passed. Olivia looked at him and saw her own invisible scars reflected in his posture and in the way he sometimes flinched, expecting only trouble. What others called danger, she recognized as the instinct to protect yourself when the world hasn't been kind. In Rocky, Olivia didn't see a threat. She saw a living reminder of how much hurt can hide under the surface, waiting for someone gentle enough to notice. Ruby's visits to Houston Paws Rescue became a quiet routine, slipping into her life like early morning light through her bedroom window. Each day after school, she came through the big blue gate, waving shyly to Olivia and the few staff who now expected her. With time, she'd learned the best way to approach Rocky. No sudden movements, no reaching out fast. Instead, she spoke to him softly, trying out gentle commands she'd picked up from videos and her own steady patience. Ruby even brought small games, tossing a tennis ball through the fence, dangling homemade toys from string, or drawing colorful pictures she would tape near Rocky's run. Sometimes she would hum a tune as she played, the same ones she sang at home on long car rides with her mom. Rocky, though still cautious, started to respond. He'd perk up when Ruby called him, coming a little closer with each passing day. He learned to sit and then to rest his chin on the fence rail, brown eyes watching as Ruby talked to him or offered a treat. His tail, once stiff and uneasy, began to give tiny, hopeful wags. Every bit of progress felt huge. One day, he even let her stroke the fur at the top of his head for a few seconds before stepping away, not in fear, but in his own way of saying he needed space. Not everyone gave them encouraging looks. There were always eyes lingering a little too long on Ruby, watching her more than they watched Rocky. Ruby was noticeably the only black child among the volunteers and visitors. Some people muttered under their breath. Others simply stared. Olivia noticed, too, the way staff whispered or hurried to check up on their little corner more than seemed necessary. A few even questioned whether it was wise to let Ruby spend so much time by Rocky's side. But all around them, the mood at the shelter gradually started shifting. Maybe it was Rocky's change, or perhaps it was the way Ruby went about things. With patience, confidence, and open-heartedness, the old shadows that weighed down the place started to lift. Some visitors found themselves lingering longer, drawn in by the calm energy of girl and dog. Even a few regulars, at first skeptical, began to smile at Ruby and offer quiet words of encouragement. It was slow going, but the rescue felt a bit less heavy, little by little, because of what Ruby and Rocky were building together. One grey afternoon, thick clouds rolled across the Houston sky, the kind that promised rain for hours. Olivia and Ruby arrived as usual, but by the time they stepped into the shelter, thunder was rumbling, and the wind made the old sign creak against the fence. Most of the animals were restless, pacing their kennels, unsettled by the change in weather. At first, staff tried to keep things running smoothly, but then a sudden crash ripped through the back hallway. A section of the roof over the old kennels had caved in from the weight of pooling rainwater. Panic swept through Houston Paws Rescue. Volunteers scrambled to reach the animals, shouting directions and calling out names. Some of the dogs were already whimpering, barking frantically as water poured in, but Rocky, in his corner crate, wouldn't budge, even with the chaos all around and Mike calling to him with a leash in hand. The dog stayed frozen, pressed against the far wall. The more they tried, the more he dug in, refusing to move, even as the noise and confusion built up. Amid the shouts and clatter, Ruby, who had been helping carry blankets, saw Rocky's frightened eyes and squeezed through the busy crowd. Olivia called after her, worried, but there was no stopping Ruby. She knelt at the edge of Rocky's crate, speaking softly, her voice low and steady in a space full of panic. She didn't raise her voice or beg, she just started humming one of her church songs, the same familiar tune she'd always used to calm him. Slowly, Rocky's body relaxed. Then when Ruby reached out her hand and called to him, he crept forward, nose to her palm. To everyone's surprise, with just her calm encouragement, Rocky followed Ruby straight out of his kennel, weaving through puddles and ducking beneath. Dangling wires without a second glance at the rest of the chaos, Mike just stood there, mouth hanging open, and the other volunteers paused what they were doing, watching this unlikely pair. Afterwards, as everyone tried to take in what they'd seen, the attention on Ruby grew even thicker. Some volunteers said she was a miracle worker, that she must be the key to helping Rocky heal enough for adoption. Others grumbled that a child shouldn't be put in situations like this, that maybe the shelter was letting things go too far. But one thing was clear. Ruby and Rocky's bond was no longer just quiet progress at the fence. Now, for better or worse, everyone could see the trust they shared, and nobody could ignore the hope they brought into the battered old shelter. After the chaos of the storm, word of what happened spread far faster than Olivia had expected. A volunteer had pulled out her phone during the rush and captured the whole thing. Ruby walking into the mess, calming Rocky and leading him out while the grown-ups watched in disbelief. By the next morning, clips were popping up everywhere on local social media and in neighborhood text chains. The video didn't just show a dramatic moment at Houston Paws rescue, it turned Rocky into the invincible dog and Ruby into the dog whisperer. Names that seemed to come out of nowhere and stick overnight. Curiosity swept across Houston. People who might never have set foot near the shelter before now lined up on weekends, hoping to catch a glimpse of Rocky or trade a few words with Ruby. The staff started fielding calls from reporters and animal advocates. One magazine wanted to do a little write-up, and a radio host asked Olivia if Ruby might speak on the air. For a while, every day brought new faces peering in through the chain-link fence or trying to snap photos as Ruby sat on the ground, humming her tunes and drawing pictures for Rocky. The sudden flood of attention made Olivia uneasy. She'd always guided Ruby to take pride in her strength, but taught her too to move quietly when the world seemed hostile. Now it felt like all eyes were on her daughter for the first time, but not in a way that felt safe. Olivia knew exactly how quickly admiration and kindness could twist into something less friendly, especially for black girls in neighborhoods, where they were too often overlooked until there was something odd, something newsworthy to see. She worried. Would Ruby be able to hang on to the bits of joy and wonder that hadn't yet been clouded by adult doubt or ugly words? Would the sudden fame change how Ruby saw herself or how the world insisted on seeing her? Olivia listened to other parents whisper about the video, about whether it was right to put a child in the middle of an animal rescue, even as they smiled and congratulated her. There was pride. Of course there was pride, but also a nervousness that sat heavy in Olivia's chest. All at once, Ruby stood in a spotlight meant for someone else, and Olivia couldn't stop thinking about how heavy that light could get for someone still learning their place in a world packed with unseen rules. With so many people stopping by and calling every day, the leadership team at Houston Paws Rescue started thinking about how to use this moment to their advantage. They met one evening in the break room with coffee and half-eaten muffins, tossing around ideas. Finally, someone suggested hosting a big adoption and fundraiser event, something with banners and booths, food trucks out by the front entrance, and maybe even music. Of course, at the center of it all would be Rocky and Ruby, the faces everyone wanted to see. The flyer that later showed up on social media featured a picture of the two of them together, Ruby beaming and Rocky sitting quietly at her side. As the weekend drew closer, Olivia felt her worry sharpen. She understood the shelter needed the money and support, but she still flinched at the thought of her daughter being treated like part of an attraction. Whether folks meant well or not, it felt odd to have so many strangers drawn in by a girl, and a dog who had found each other simply by showing up day after day, not by any plan or spectacle. Still, Ruby seemed excited and promised her mum she was up for it, saying she wanted people to see Rocky as more than just a story on their phone screens. The fair arrived on a sunlit Saturday morning, filling the shelter's yard with bursts of color. Streamers twisted around posts, folding tables stacked with homemade baked goods, and families leading eager kids up and down the aisles of animals waiting for a new home. There were more people than the shelter had ever seen at once, and everywhere Ruby went with Rocky at her side, folks gathered in small crowds, asking questions or snapping photos from a respectful distance. Rocky handled it better than anyone expected, tail wagging as he walked beside Ruby, keeping close but no longer hiding behind her legs. The real surprise came late in the day, when a quiet boy, no older than 6, asked if he could pet Rocky. There was a pause, as everyone nearby went still. Ruby glanced up, catching Rocky's eye, and offered him a small, encouraging nod. With that gentle signal, Rocky leaned in and stood steady as the boy touched his fur, calm and patient, not a hint of fear or tension in his body. The adults around them exchanged wide-eyed looks, realizing they were witnessing something special. That moment of connection showed just how far Rocky had come, and also how much work still lay ahead. It was progress, slow and fragile, but real. And as the crowd cheered and took one more round of pictures, Olivia knew that healing wasn't a straight path for Rocky or for Ruby, but those unexpected moments of trust were what mattered most. Just as the excitement at the adoption fair reached its high point, with kids running around, music playing, and people filling out paperwork for new pets, a different kind of energy entered the shelter yard. An elderly man, moving slowly but with a sense of purpose, paused near the welcome tent, looking around as if searching for something or someone. He wore a faded Astros cap and clutched an old leash in his hand. Staff exchanged confused looks, while Olivia noticed the change in Rocky almost immediately. The dog had been relaxed until now, but at the sight of this stranger, his tail stopped wagging and his body tensed, eyes darting toward Ruby, then back at the man. The volunteer at the entrance stepped closer. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, polite but a little wary. The man's voice was cracked but clear as he introduced himself. "My name is Tom Bennett. Years ago, I was Rocky's owner. I needed to come and see him again." At that, an uncomfortable hush spread across the fair. Several staff members remembered reading the notes in Rocky's old file. Details had never been fully explained, only hinted at in the margins of intake paperwork and quietly passed down between volunteers. Tom's presence seemed to open the door to old hurts everyone had tried to leave behind. He moved closer, but not too close, and looked at Rocky with an expression that was hard to read, part sadness, part regret. Ruby, sensing something was off, knelt beside Rocky, gently resting her hand on his back. Rocky kept glancing between her and Tom, uncertain and anxious, but not aggressive. The tension grew thick as Tom began to speak haltingly about letting Rocky go years before, hinting At circumstances he could never fix and pain that had haunted them both since. He apologized, his voice soft, talking not only to the people in front of him, but to Rocky himself, as if trying to reach both the grown dog and the frightened puppy he once knew. Nobody quite knew how to act. Olivia stepped close to her daughter, wrapping her arm around Ruby's shoulders in silent support. It was clear that wounds like these did not heal with a single apology, nor with time alone. The cheerful festival suddenly felt smaller, like the sun had dipped behind a cloud, and in that moment everyone saw how history, no matter how deeply buried, could shape even the happiest of new beginnings. After Tom Bennett's appearance brought Rocky's difficult history into the open, the board at Houston Paws Rescue started talking about what to do next. The story had caught even more attention, not just from local folks, but now from organizations in other states. One rescue group from Georgia reached out, offering a generous donation if Rocky could join their program and be rehomed there. Their argument was simple. Rocky's internet fame and unique past would help find him a loving family in a new place, and the money could support Houston Paws Rescue in fixing the storm damage, caring for the animals, and maybe even upgrading their old facilities. For a struggling shelter, the offer sounded pretty tempting, but as soon as the idea was raised, people took sides. Some of the board members, thinking about all the animals under their roof and the fundraising struggles every year, saw the proposal as a path to a more stable future for everyone. Others argued that Rocky had finally found a sense of belonging with Ruby and was just beginning to trust again. It was not right, they said, to take him away from the only person who had managed to reach him, all for the sake of cash. Out in the yard, Ruby seemed to feel the weight of every whisper. She'd thought the past few weeks had brought her and Rocky to a new and happier place, but suddenly it felt shaky again. She paid attention to Rocky's every move, watching his ears and his eyes, seeing both his hope and his fear shine through whenever he looked at her. Ruby spent her lunch breaks by his pen, humming soft songs and gently tracing patterns on her jeans as she tried not to worry out loud. For Olivia, the idea of separating the two was not just about a girl and her dog. She remembered every time she or Ruby had been overlooked or uprooted because someone else thought they knew best. The possible loss brought back old feelings she had worked her whole life to keep at bay. A fear of being told you do not belong, or worse, that you are safer somewhere out of sight. Standing in the break room, listening to board members debate, Olivia struggled to keep her voice calm. She knew what it meant to lose something you had finally begun to trust, and she couldn't help but see her own struggle in the way Rocky waited quietly for answers, not quite daring to get his hopes up. As the shelter kept debating what to do with Rocky, tensions in and around Houston Paws Rescue grew sharper. Some staff began to avoid eye contact in the hallway, while rumors lingered over lunch tables. Ruby tried to focus on homework or on little daily routines, but her mind always drifted back to Rocky and the threat of losing him. On a grey Thursday, she stopped by the public library to return a stack of books for a school project. The place was busy, with mothers corralling toddlers, high school kids quietly chatting, and a few regulars nodding off in cushioned chairs. As Ruby started the walk home, she had that prickly feeling you get when something is just a bit off. She clutched her backpack straps tighter and kept her pace steady while pretending to check her phone. Every so often she glanced over her shoulder. There was a shadowy figure trailing her, hanging back but always matching her steps. Ruby's heart sped up. She crossed to the other side of the street, her mind racing through everything her mom had taught her about staying safe in the city. She considered turning into one of the neighborhood shops or even ducking into an alley, but she worried that might make things worse. Just when panic threatened to bubble over, a flash of fur burst into the scene. Rocky, who had calmly slipped out of his run at the shelter while the afternoon shift was distracted, bounded up the sidewalk. He moved with purpose, his eyes focused only on Ruby. She had taught Rocky special commands during their play sessions, and now it seemed like he remembered them all. He circled around and stood between her and the stranger, body steady but not threatening, just enough to make a clear point. The person following her thought twice, hesitated, and quietly faded away. The danger, real or imagined, passed just as quickly as it had appeared. Ruby let out a huge breath and dropped right to her knees, burying her face in Rocky's neck while he stood perfectly still. She hugged him hard, feeling shaky relief and real safety all at once. Anyone watching would have seen how much trust and comfort pulsed between them. Word about what happened spread around the neighborhood by the next day. Even those who had doubted, who muttered about the strange connection between a young black girl and a so-called dangerous dog, stopped and admitted that their bond was something powerful. Nobody could call it luck anymore. It was clear to everyone that Ruby and Rocky needed each other in ways no one could fully explain. Even as admiration for Ruby and Rocky grew in the neighborhood, an uglier undercurrent began to spread. Whispers bubbled up at church potlucks and around the checkout counter at the grocery store. Little digs and snide comments about whether Olivia was being a responsible parent. Some people, usually the ones who had never bothered to get to know Ruby or Rocky, asked out loud if it was safe for kids like that to spend so much time with dogs like him. The words hit heavier because it was clear what they meant. There were reminders tucked between the lines of conversation that some neighbors still judged Ruby not just for her friendship with a tough old shelter dog, but for the color of her skin and the humble way her family lived. It was hard for Olivia to ignore the sting of these rumors, especially when a few people went as far as to question if she was fit to be a mother. She heard it in the pointed questions at the school gates, the warnings at the shelter that maybe kids should not mess around with rescues that come with baggage. Some of the worst messages arrived anonymously, little notes in the mailbox or mean-spirited emails that left her hands shaking. There was no misunderstanding the kind of fear and anger those words were meant to spark, not just about Rocky, but about Ruby, and really about Olivia herself for doing things differently in a world that expected her to stay quietly out of sight. More than once, Olivia thought about pulling Ruby out of the shelter, maybe moving her to a different neighborhood or school just to keep her safe. The pain of those words brought back old memories, times when Olivia had learned to swallow pride, to survive in places that made her feel small. But then she would watch Ruby with Rocky, see how her daughter stood taller now, not in spite of people's stares, but because of them. Ruby had found her voice, gently but firmly letting others know that she and Rocky belonged exactly where they were. It gave Olivia hope, even as it scared her. Olivia realized she faced an impossible choice: shield Ruby from cruelty at all costs, or let her keep shining, despite the people who would always try to dim her light. In long, quiet evenings, at home, Olivia held her daughter close and told her over and over that her strength and her love were nothing to hide. It was time Olivia decided to stand with Ruby and let the world see their pride, not just in words, but in how they lived every single day. Eventually, everything came to a head at a late afternoon meeting in the Houston Paws Rescue Conference Room. Folding chairs were crowded with people, members of the board, staff, some city officials and neighbors who had shown up to make their voices heard. The air buzzed with low conversations and nervous energy. There were homemade cookies on a tray that nobody touched. Everyone was waiting for the moment they would have to choose a side. At first, the debate circled around Rocky's future. One group, mostly board members worried about resources, kept bringing up the donation from Georgia, reminding everyone about the leaking roof and the rising cost of medicine. Another group, made up of volunteers and families like Olivia's, insisted that Rocky should stay and not have his life uprooted just when he had found his place. A few people, their words polite but their tone distant, tried to steer the talk back to rules and insurance policies, making it sound like the whole thing was nothing personal. But over time, the conversation drifted into something bigger. It was no longer just about a dog and a girl. Folks started speaking about belonging and fairness, recalling old stories about who gets to feel safe and welcome in their own city. It was uncomfortable, even for people who thought they had already made up their minds. It became about who belonged in the community and who got to decide. Olivia waited until nearly the end, hands sweaty and voice shaking just a bit. When her turn came, she stood, glanced down at Ruby, and told the room about what it felt like for her daughter to be doubted, about the small cruelties that followed them day after day. She admitted her own fears, not just about losing Rocky, but about what it meant to always be on trial for simply wanting her child to be seen and loved. She finished by insisting gently but firmly that Ruby deserved to take up space and that nobody should have to ask permission to belong where their heart led them. Some people sat in silence when Olivia was done. Others nodded, teary-eyed or thoughtful. Of course, there were those who crossed their arms and stared at the floor, unmoved. After more back and forth and a few terse exchanges between the different sides, the chairwoman announced that no decision would be made that night. As everyone filtered out into the parking lot, tension hung heavy in the air. For Ruby and Olivia, the waiting game grew even harder. Every extra day Rocky spent in limbo felt like a thread could snap at any moment. While the back and forth about Rocky's future dragged on, life in the shelter found its own steady rhythm, separate from all the arguments and decisions hanging over everyone's heads. Ruby tried her best not to let the tension creep into her time with Rocky. She kept up their old routines, humming their silly tunes and making up new ones, turning every visit into something special that only the two of them really understood. The music changed from training tool into a kind of language, soft whistles and gentle claps that meant dinner time or slow choruses that meant it was time to rest. Rocky would prick up his ears and sometimes even wag his tail in time to Ruby's songs, a sure sign that he felt safe when she was near. Other volunteers started to notice that things in the shelter seemed a little brighter, even in the middle of all the stress. There were fresh drawings taped along the hallway walls, bright crayon pictures of dogs, cats, and even the shelter itself, some signed by Ruby. She recruited a few of the younger kids and turned an unused corner of the break room into a story spot with blankets and a tub of battered library books. Soon enough, the shelter felt less like an in-between space and more like a place where friendships took root. Where once there had been only cold tile floors and echoing barks, now there were warm blankets, hand-painted signs, and laughter that hung around even after the lights clicked off at night. But at home and late at night, Olivia could hardly escape the weight pressing down on her. She worried, not just about whether Ruby would get to keep Rocky, but about what all this would mean for her future. Olivia sat alone more often now in the small staff kitchen, head in her hands, stifling her tears so no one would see. She felt almost broken by the fear that, despite everything she taught Ruby about strength and pride, her daughter might still be forced to face the harsh judgment of the world, pushed to hide or shrink herself just to stay safe. For Olivia, each hopeful moment in the shelter brought with it a deep ache, a fear that history would loop back on itself and draw Ruby into the same pattern of being tested and doubted for things she could not change. Even as color and hope bloomed inside the shelter, Olivia knew that the real challenge was making sure it lasted long enough for Ruby and Rocky to finally call it home. Just as it seemed like things might finally settle down, another hard twist came their way. One morning, a couple of representatives from a well-known animal rescue group in New York City showed up at Houston Paws Rescue. They had heard about Rocky, his story had made the rounds online by then, and they floated a proposal. That sounded almost too good to be true. If the shelter agreed to let Rocky be adopted by a family in the city, their organization would channel a large donation to Houston Paws Rescue, enough to cover expenses for at least a year or two, maybe even more. The catch was clear, though. The transfer had to happen right away, and Rocky would have to leave Texas forever. When Ruby overheard the news, her face crumpled and her hands balled into small fists. She tried to listen quietly as the adults explained the chance this money would give the shelter, how it could help dozens of other animals and pay for projects that had been pushed aside for way too long. To her, the numbers only sounded like a wall everyone expected her to climb alone, one that meant losing Rocky, the friend who gave her comfort when everything else felt shaky. Even the bright colors she had drawn on the walls looked dull to her that afternoon. She avoided Rocky's pen, not wanting him to see her cry. But something surprising happened as word spread through the neighborhood. Instead of just watching from the sidelines, several locals, many of them regular visitors at the shelter, and even a couple of old-timers who usually kept to themselves, started talking about how unfair it was for Ruby and Rocky to be separated. Someone made a simple paper petition and left it in the coffee shop. Names filled the page. Pretty soon, a mother who lived 3 doors down posted about it online, and suddenly parents, teachers, other kids, librarians, and folks from the food bank signed too. People started to show up at the shelter just to let their support be seen. Debates started popping up at church meetings, outside Sunday barbecue pits, and on corners outside the laundromat. Everyone had thoughts about what it meant to save a life. Was it really rescue if it tore apart the bonds that helped both a dog and a girl believe they mattered? The shelter became a place full of passionate voices, all tangled up with questions about what belonging and second chances really looked like. Searching for middle ground after weeks of tense discussions and mounting pressure, the Houston Paws Rescue leadership decided to try one last idea before making any final decisions about Rocky's future. They called Olivia to explain that Ruby and Rocky would be given an official observation period together. For the next month, under the watch of both shelter staff and outside professionals, Ruby could continue visiting Rocky each afternoon. Their interactions would be closely monitored, not just by animal behaviorists, but also by a friendly, steady child psychologist who was brought in to make sure everyone felt safe and heard. At first, the rules felt stiff and awkward. Every session began with checklists and soft questions, while Rocky's tail wagged a little slower than usual. But no amount of paperwork could hide what was plain to anyone paying attention. Over those weeks, Ruby's gentle routines, her singing, her quiet stories shared with Rocky curled up against her legs, the way she included even shy staff in their games, settled the air in the room and made the old dog visibly calmer. Chichiki. Psychologists' reports soon filled up with words like comfort, trust, and positive change. Even hardened board members who had stayed on the fence for too long now hung around just to watch the pair interact. It was during this observation period that Ruby and Rocky grew even closer to Thomas, one of the longest-serving shelter staff, and a regular face every evening. Tomas had always looked after the dogs with a quiet touch, but he found himself drawn into Ruby's world of small rituals and daily hope. He listened to her stories, learned some of her music cues for Rocky, and started to open up about his own struggles, about how he had tried for years to hold on to memories that hurt him, and how seeing Ruby's hope with Rocky made him believe that maybe love was not always about holding on to the past. Sometimes it was about building something better for tomorrow. The longer the trial went on, the harder it became for anyone to ignore what was happening in front of them. What they saw was not just a girl finding comfort in a dog, or a dog learning to trust people again. It was the kind of gentle, honest connection that seemed to smooth out old scars and plant the seeds for real healing, even in the hearts of those who once held back. Bit by bit, the doubters fell silent, recognizing that what had grown between Ruby, Rocky, and Tomas was something deep and rare, made out of pain, stitched together with hope, and lived out loud with a kind of care none of them had seen before. In a final act of unity, the neighborhood pulled together and organized the Houston Hope Festival, a vibrant community celebration spread across the park beside the shelter. Flyers showed up taped to light poles and tucked inside library books. Everyone was invited. There were food trucks serving barbecue and tamales, booths run by local artists and schools, and 3 stages for dancing, poetry, gospel choirs, and mariachi bands that played well into dusk. Friends and strangers set up folding chairs and picnic blankets, determined to do something that was about more than just Rocky's fate. This was bigger. It was a moment for everyone to say, in their own way, that nobody here deserved to be left out. The centerpiece of the festival was a showcase highlighting the bond between Ruby and Rocky. Olivia helped her daughter get ready behind the stage, brushing out Ruby's curls as gently as she could, while Ruby practiced her song under her breath. By the time their turn came, the whole crowd seemed to quiet down as Ruby stepped into the sunlight, Rocky wagging calmly at her side. The music started, soft and steady, Ruby's voice floating across the park, steady, even though her hands shook a little. She sang about belonging and home, and between verses she called out gentle commands. Rocky listened close, following her every word. He sat, spun, and even did his silly trick where he pressed his nose against her palm and gave her a high five. Their trust was so easy to see, it made even the most stubborn old-timers smile, a few wiping tears as the pair bowed together at the end. Money from raffle tickets and food sales filled the shelter's donation jar, but the true value of the festival was not measured in dollars. As the sun set over Houston, the crowd clapped along to Ruby's last song, a feeling of pride stretched between people who might never have talked before. Olivia hugged Ruby tight, tears running down her face as parents and teachers came over to say how moved they had been. Even Tomas, with a rare grin, joined them for a photo, proud to be part of a moment that had turned pain and waiting into joy and celebration. That night, with lanterns swinging overhead and leftover tamales warming, quiet conversations, the feeling was undeniable. Being different was not just possible here, it was something to hold up high. For once, Ruby, Rocky, and Olivia stood in the middle of it all, not as exceptions, but as the real heart of the community. By the time winter rolled in, the changes inside Houston Paws Rescue felt as natural as the shift in the air outside. The hallways no longer echoed like they used to. Bright hand-drawn posters covered the walls, and new volunteers joined the regulars after hearing about the festival and Ruby's story. What was once a place people rushed through now felt more like a second home, full of chatter, shared snacks, and the warmth of people looking out for each other. But the biggest transformation was in Olivia herself. All the long nights spent worrying, the moments wishing she could protect Ruby from the world, all of that grew lighter with each passing week. Olivia watched her daughter stroll through the shelter doors after school, walking taller and more sure of herself. Ruby laughed easy, her arms swinging free, never once trying to shrink herself to fit in. She greeted everyone with the same wide grin and started volunteering to help younger kids learn how to take care of the animals. Parents stopped Olivia at church and in the grocery store to share stories about how their children talked about Ruby and Rocky at home, something that filled her with a mix of pride and relief that was hard to put into words. Then, after so many tests and official observation periods, The good news finally arrived. Rocky passed his last set of evaluations with flying colors. No more paperwork, no more questions about whether the pair belonged together. The shelter's board gathered the family in the office on a snowy December afternoon, handing over the adoption forms with more than a few misty eyes around the room. Rocky, tail swishing, promptly landed in Ruby's lap, as if he had always known this day was coming. For Olivia, Ruby, and Rocky, life was not suddenly perfect, but it was theirs, shaped by lessons in patience, hope, and the courage to hold tight to one another when everything else seemed unsure. As the sun dipped low over the Houston streets, Ruby led Rocky on their usual evening walk, her soft humming fading gently between houses and along the fence lines. That night, Olivia listened, from the porch letting the music settle around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt sure the story they had been living, the story of never quite fitting in, had finally turned the corner. The city, once split by doubt, now seemed to share in their quiet triumph, learning in its own way that belonging, pride, and bravery go far deeper than any label or old prejudice had ever suggested.